And then introduce yourself for us.
Yes, my name is Mike Hayden. I'm a lawyer in Evansville, have been for 46 years.
And what's your background starting from where you were born?
Well, I was born in Evansville in 1947, March 14th. I grew up kind of downtown area until I was about 9 years old. Then I moved out to the west side. I attended St. Agnes Grade School in Howe. Went to Mater Dei High School and graduated in 1965. After that, I went to Indiana University for 1 year. Then I attended, I think the second class ever at USI, which was known as ISUE in those days, and went a year and a half there. And then in order to graduate, I had to transfer to Terre Haute, and I finished my undergrad degree in 1969 with a degree in business from Indiana State University.
Then what'd you do?
Taught school for 1 year. Actually, I taught school for 2 years. I moved to Indianapolis. My sister, who's married to a doctor there, was a member of a parish in Indianapolis, and they were hiring teachers. So this would have been 1969-70, and I got a job teaching fourth grade kids, and I made $4,615. I still remember my salary, and I did that. Then my second year, I applied to law school, and I was accepted at Indiana University at Indianapolis, the IUPUI campus.
Why'd you decide to do that?
Well, obviously, I knew I wasn't going to remain in teaching. I had a daughter I got married in my junior year. I had a daughter my senior year. So she was only, she would have been 6 months old when I moved to Indianapolis to begin teaching. And so my wife did work, but it was still kind of a struggle with what I was making. So I decided to apply for law school. It wasn't necessarily any kind of dream of mine. I knew a couple of attorneys. I had a couple of family members that were good friends with attorneys, George Barnett being one of them. And they suggested it. So have you ever considered law school? I said, I really haven't. And I started looking into it and decided to give it a shot and applied. And again, was accepted and started that around 1971 or so.
And then when did you graduate?
I graduated in 1973. I think I was sworn into the bar October 10th of 1973. I worked mostly through law school. That was an era where there were only night classes at the IUPUI campus. And of course, I had a family, so I really had to work. And one thing that I really kind of regret about law school is like my last year of law school, my wife became ill and couldn't work. And I had to get a job to make some money. And I actually took a job on the railroad, which was a summer job. And I was hired in as a fireman. I don't know if you know what that is or not, but that's the guy that sits up with the engineer. Well, little did I know that job in the summer would go the whole following year because she became sick, and I just said, "Can I stay on?" And they said, "Sure." Well, I actually was driving trains through downtown Indianapolis carrying chemicals, probably flammable materials, and little did Indianapolis know that they were in grave danger as I was driving this train through Indianapolis. And then when the engineer would take over, I would always have my book with me, or my books. And so I'd have a very thick book that they gave you in law school to read cases. So while he was driving the train, I was kind of looking out, but at the same time, I was kind of catching up on some of my work. So it was an interesting experience that last year of law school.
What'd you do after you graduated?
After I graduated, I got a job with George Barnett,
Senior,
who had an office in the old Permanent Federal Building, and he was with Jim Buteau. And they weren't a partnership. They basically shared office space. And the first day I showed up for work, I don't think George had ever had anyone working with him. And actually, my uncle, who was a good friend of his, helped get me that job. So when I got there probably 30 minutes before the office opened. I was so excited to get there. And he gets there and looks at me what are you doing here? And I said, George, this is the day I'm supposed to, I actually called him Mr. Barnett then. This is the day I'm supposed to show up for work. Oh, so, so he invites me in and introduced me to the secretary. I said, well, where would you like for me to sit down? Well, there was an office in there, but it was totally cluttered with files. I mean, he had just totally forgotten that I was even going to be there. So I wasn't off to exactly a great start, but we got the office cleaned up after a couple of days, and George, I don't think really was used to dealing with any type of associate, you know. Now, having said that, I learned a lot from him. I mean, he was really a very, very good lawyer. And he was real close friends with John Klaus and Jack Davis. They all kind of ran around together, and they would go to the F's for that luncheon table they used to have, where they would just kind of hold court. And I got invited a few times for that, but I'm not so sure I was equipped at that age to handle the barbs that were going back and forth with those guys. But still, it was fun, interesting, and I learned a lot. Those were kind of the days where I think I came in just when notice pleading really started. But those guys had been trained entirely differently. I mean, they would put together motions that, 15, 20 pages long, arguing about where a pronoun was, or a comma, or a sentence, and interpreting statutes. And so I kind of learned, how they went about that. But those guys were really invested in the pursuit of law and filing appropriate motions and arguing them and would spend a lot of those times at F's discussing those kinds of things. And that was very educational for a young lawyer to listen to that.
Remember what your salary was?
Yeah, I sure do. I think it was a little over $10,000, which was a big boost from what I was making teaching, but way less than what I made on the railroad my senior year of law school. So I actually took a pay cut to become a lawyer, which is another bit of irony.
What kind of work did you do for George?
He had me work on a couple criminal files. He did a practice that I really kind of incorporated myself, a pretty general practice. Personal injury, plaintiff personal injury work, criminal work. He did some family law, and I still do family law. He didn't do any bankruptcies, which I do, but and he had some civil litigation cases, of course, that he worked on. But he was an extremely bright man. Liked to have a good time as that whole group did, and nothing wrong with that, because I certainly have enjoyed myself along the way as well. But a whole different breed. That was a totally different breed than maybe what you see today. And I don't mean that in a real negative way. It was just different. And even in the way they approached the practice of law, I think was somewhat different than the way it is now.
How long were you with him?
Just a year. And, I think I went in and said, Mr. Barnett, I'm going to have a little more money. And he just wasn't prepared for that. So I took a job. I applied and was hired right away with Bailey Merrill's old firm. And so Bailey Merrill was an ex-congressman who had a firm in the Union Federal Building. And he was in with Gene Johnson, Jack Schrader, who had a really huge real estate practice. Jerry Evans was in that firm. And then I think a year or two after I was there, Randy Craig was hired. So they had some really bright people in that firm. I probably worked closer with Gene Johnson than I did anyone else. Gene had a couple clients that were involved in civil litigation that I kind of got involved in. And I also had a couple personal injury cases there that I don't even know how those ended up at the firm, but I got those. So I think I worked for him for maybe 3 years, 3 or 4 years or so. And after that...
Did you have much contact with Bailey Merrill and that?
Yeah, I sure did.
Tell us about him.
Bailey was such an interesting man. I mean, he was old school. but he had a keen sense of humor and a keen wit. And probably the most notable case that I ever had with him was that briefly there was a coal loading apparatus set up down on the river to load barges. And this company had failed to pay their rent to who owned the equipment. And so they hired us, the company, to collect the money from this outfit that had this set up on the river. And a big argument ensued over where's the state line, who had jurisdiction of that case, whether it was Indiana or Kentucky. And that thing went all the way to the Indiana Supreme Court. And so I still remember driving up there with Bailey, talking about that case, and then just talking about his days as a congressman. He was really an interesting guy. He lived down on First Street in one of those grand old houses. I don't think he ever had any children. He was married a long, long time, and talked about his politics and politicians he had met. And so yeah, I did have a lot of interaction with Bailey Merrill. Jack Schrader, I used to do some title work for him. Now that's kind of coming back to me. He showed me how to do title opinions, and he kind of monopolized that whole business, which has changed a lot since then with title insurance.
Were you reading abstracts back then?
I was, yeah. I mean, his office would be stacked full of abstracts, and he just cranked those things out. And so, yeah, I was reading abstracts back then. And you very rarely even see one anymore. But that was an interesting way to practice.
So how long were you there?
I was there 4 or 5 years. And then an opportunity came up. I had a brother-in-law who was the doctor I talked about earlier. And he was in the coal, he wanted to get into the coal business, or he didn't want to he was approached to get into the coal business. In retrospect, bad move on his part. He should have stuck to being a physician. But they asked me to come along as kind of their general counsel, and offered me enough money that I could work for them and still maintain an office. So I actually terminated my employment with the Merrill firm and did the coal work, and then opened up my own office. And I was probably in my late 20s, maybe early 30 when I did that. Now, I also, along the line, neglected to mention I was a part-time prosecutor. I worked for Bill Burney. I did that for years too. I think I did that after I left George and was with Merrill. I then became a part-time public defender in misdemeanor court, and I did my prosecuting work in misdemeanor court. And then I actually became a magistrate in misdemeanor court.
That's that part-time?
Part-time, from ages 29 to 33. I still remember the ages. And the other magistrate was Herb Roberts, who was another character. I mean, it seems like that whole generation of lawyers were just characters. And, Herb's situation didn't end well as he got older. But I liked Herb. He was fun to work with. He had been a prosecutor years before I ever started to become practicing law.
What'd you do in the prosecutor's office?
I worked in misdemeanor court. I don't think I ever had any felony cases assigned to me. I just worked in misdemeanor court.
And those were part-time jobs back then?
They were part-time jobs back then. And I would have kept that magistrate job in misdemeanor court, but that is when they decided to go full-time. I forget that gentleman's name who was president of the Bar Association, but he was a big proponent of having a full-time prosecutor. A magistrate, and then that all changed. And so I was asked if I wanted to become a full-time magistrate. Well, I kind of had my private practice going at that time, and I decided to focus on that, so I gave that up.
So where did you practice when you were by yourself then?
I was downtown very shortly in the court building, and then in 1980, so now that's just 7 years after I started practicing law, I bought an office on First Avenue, 2906 First Avenue, and I'm still there. So I've been there now almost 39 years. I always say when people talk about habits that I'm not a creature of habit, but I've been in the same office 39 years. In 1980, when I opened that office, I hired a young woman, Susan Stipler now, out of U of E, who was a senior, one of the first paralegal graduates ever. I think it might have been their first class. Hired her in 1980, and she's still working for me. So she's been with me for 39 years. I don't know how I would have managed without her.
So how'd the coal business work out?
Not well. Like a lot of coal businesses, it finally shut its doors, and that was an incredibly ruthless business. I mean, you just didn't know who you were talking to, whether they were friend, foe, from one day to the next. And everyone was trying to speculate and get wealthy, and I learned a lot. I mean, anytime you go through an experience like that, you learn a lot of how to deal with people and the contracts, and because I had to negotiate coal contracts with this company, but it didn't end badly for me. I mean, I was an investor, but it didn't end too well for the investors. So then I just started practicing law at my office full time, and have been doing that ever since.
And do you have other appointments, part-time jobs while you've been practicing all these years?
Yes. So from about 1983 is when I lost the magistrate job. I didn't have any part-time appointments until 2000. And in 2000, Judge Linsing, who is a good friend of mine and a terrific guy, was judge in juvenile court, and one of the public defenders left. And I think it was Sig Labhart, who had been working with him for a number of years. So he called me one day out of the blue and said, "Hey, would you be interested in being public defender in juvenile court?" And I said, "Well, maybe. I don't know. I hadn't really ever thought about that anymore." And so I did. I accepted that position. And Jeff Lance and I were the only two public defenders in that court up until I left juvenile court in 2007 as a public defender. I switched over to circuit court, where I'm still a public defender. I would have never dreamed I would have held on to that this long, but I've actually enjoyed it a lot. And so I worked for Judge Linsing for 7 years. And Jeff and I, like I said, we had the whole thing. We had all the delinquency cases. We had all the termination cases. We had all the chins cases. And now I think, if I'm not mistaken, there might be 12 attorneys that handle those cases. And Judge Linsing was a terrific guy. But when he wanted you, you had to be there. And at that time, they had detention hearings for kids. And so if a youth got arrested, he might call you at 2:30 and say, "I need you over here in 10 minutes." And I'd say many times, "Well, Judge, I've got a deposition starting in 15. Oh, they can wait. You come on over. We'll get this done right away." And that was just kind of his. He was a forceful personality, but a good guy. I mean, a good judge, and I liked him. But when he said be there, you were there. So that was kind of interesting working with him. But another good aspect of that is I got to work with Jeff Lance, and I had never had that opportunity. And Jeff was an incredibly good lawyer, and so working with him was a lot of fun too.
Were you ever in his prosecutor's office when he was prosecutor after Bill Burney?
No, I never did return to the prosecutors. The only one I ever worked for was Bill Burney.
So how did your practice develop then after you went up to First Avenue? What type of work did you do? And
Family law, which encompasses everything, divorce. I always kind of make a joke, and I don't even know if this is a good thing to say publicly, but somebody always asks me, "Well, what kind of practice do you do?" And I said, "Well, just about anything that involves some kind of human suffering, I'm there. Divorces, estates, personal injury, bankruptcy, debt problems. As attorneys, we all take this for granted, because in a way you have to kind of take yourself out of that because if you really started dealing emotionally with everybody's problems, it would almost be too much. I almost liken it to when you go to an emergency room and you see some of the nurses and doctors joking and laughing, and you're there for something serious. You think, well, how could they be joking and laughing? Well, I understand that. I mean, they have to get their mind off the seriousness of it just to deal with it. And I think to a large extent, we as attorneys have to represent our clients, but we have to kind of take ourselves away from that emotionally just to deal with some of the terrible problems that we encounter, because some of them are very bad.
How do you, how's your clientele developed? Where do your clients come from? Why do they come to you?
That's a good question. I've been on First Avenue for so many years, and I've got a big sign. A lot of people just have driven by there, and then they'll stop. I haven't done a tremendous amount of advertising. I tried TV a little bit, but that's such an investment that I just didn't want to really get into that, because once you get in, and it's full bore, and I didn't want to invest that kind of money. Um, I get some personal referrals from people. Some attorneys might call me and know I do bankruptcies, want me to handle those. My criminal practice was probably developed as a result of being a public defender, because people know that I do that. So I would say those 4 or 5 areas, but just associations, friends that I've made over the years. But very little, I think, from advertising, although I did do the yellow pages but not the full page ads that a lot of the guys did.
Did you do much trial work, or have you done much trial work?
I have done a lot of trial work. I've done a lot of civil personal injury cases, and certainly not to the extent that some attorneys have. But I know, for instance, that a lot of the personal injury firms that actually advertise personal injury, I probably maybe have tried as many cases as some of those firms, because I like trial work. It's pressure packed. I mean, it can be very difficult, but once I kind of take that case, I'm all in, and if I have to try it, I will. So I've done a lot of PI work, and then of course I've done a lot of criminal defense trials as well. So I would say, yeah, I've done quite a bit.
How are there any criminal defense trials that are particularly memorable to you?
Well, the last one I lost is the most memorable. It was a murder case, and it was all based on circumstantial evidence, and it was I really put my heart and soul into that, and it was really, really difficult. He was found guilty. I think the jury deliberated an hour after a 4 or 5 day trial, and that's really, I found that to be really defeating, a very defeating feeling when that happens. You'd like to think that you at least gave them something to talk about for more than an hour. I mean, it takes 15 minutes just to go in and sit down and get your paper out. If they'd been out a few hours, it would have been better. It may sound silly, but you start questioning yourself, thinking, what could I have said to have made this jury deliberate a little longer about this, or at least kick some ideas around, when I thought I gave them plenty to chew on? But that just happens sometimes, So,
how has the trial practice changed over the years, do you think?
Well, one thing I think has really changed is when I started practicing. You really paid attention to the Indiana rules, the trial rules themselves. I mean, I just can remember going and reading the rules, and then I would find cases that interpret the rules, and it's hardly ever talked about anymore. I mean, the trial rules are there and they're to be used, but it's not something that tremendous emphasis is put on the trial rules. I mean, obviously they're still applicable, and we're still supposed to be bound by them, but I mean, don't ever expect to file a motion to dismiss anything for lack of something and really expect it to be granted, because the only thing that might happen is the other side's going to be given time to amend it, and which they'll do, and so it doesn't seem to. I don't know whether it's me or it's just the general practice, but even discovery cutoff dates and things like that, they used to have a lot more meaning than they do now. Now, we have a very good bar association here, and people get along with one another, and I'm not sure it's that way everywhere. But, people need time. They just generally call and say, hey, I need 30 more days. I need 30 more days. No problem. But it didn't always used to be that way. Not that people were not friendly and want to work with you, but it just seems like the cutoff dates are just kind of like a guide now instead of an actual something you're supposed to adhere to. So I'm not necessarily complaining about that. You asked me if it's what change I've noticed, and I would say that's certainly one of them.
Tell us about your relationships with the other bar members and the bar in general in this town.
Well, I think we've really got to, I do think there's kind of a good kinship among lawyers in town. One thing I did learn early on as a lawyer is how important your word was. And if you told somebody something, you better stick with it because lawyers remember exactly what you tell them. And I can remember an experience I had just a couple, 3 years ago with the prosecutor who said, "This is what I'm going to do," and made me said, "I'm going to make this offer, and this is the offer." And then 3 or 4 days later, that wasn't the offer. And I had a talk with him. I said, you're a good guy. You are bright. I think you're totally sincere. I said, but when you tell somebody something and then you change it and you go back on it, that's something that never leaves the mind of the other lawyer you talk to. And in fact, might get him to mention it to other people. And that's the way your reputation starts eroding. So I said, if you're not sure, don't tell somebody something that you're going to pay this amount for a settlement and then you pull it back, or this amount for this kind of offer for a plea bargain. I said, nothing will hurt your reputation more than that. So I've always tried to, live by that code, and I hope I have. I think I have. But young lawyers need to know that once that reputation starts, it's almost cemented, and you're fighting an uphill battle with it, and it's going to be problems for you for your whole career. So
I assume you learned that as a young lawyer from older lawyers here in town.
absolutely, yeah. There's no question. Because I still remember, those the guys I looked up to that I told you earlier, and that they would talk about that. If a lawyer's name would come up and they all knew that lawyer's word couldn't be trusted, it would be discussed. And you learned early on that don't tell any lawyer anything that you're going to retract or act like you didn't say, because we lawyers have very good memories.
Are there other lawyers through the years, especially when you were a younger lawyer, that you remember that you looked up to or that you felt were lawyers that should be emulated, or trial lawyers that were special in what they do?
Well, I had a lot of cases. Not a lot of cases. I had a case with Bob Hahn, who was a Bamberger lawyer, and he was famous for his trial advocacy. And when I was with Bailey Merrill's firm, and we hired Bob as co-counsel in that case to defend this lawsuit. And I worked with him a lot. I would go over to his office and sit down and work with him. And we'd have dinner a couple times a week during that case. It actually ended up getting tried in federal court in front of, I think, Judge Holder. And he actually offered me a job after that case was over, which was was a real compliment for me. He said, "I'd really like for you to consider coming to work for me." And I did. I went home and talked to my wife about it, but I just wasn't cut out for defense work on injury cases. There's just something, there's something about my personality that always kind of bleeds for the person injured, and I'm not saying I hate insurance companies. I've got plenty of insurance, but it would be hard for me to take that position and try to diminish somebody's recovery, which is just part of the process. And I understand it, but as lawyers and human beings, we all have these things we've grown up with, and how we. And I've always attached myself more to the little guy as opposed to the companies. I mean, I'm not against companies, but it's hard for me to fight the little guy because life can be so difficult, and that's just where I've always felt felt a bond. You know, I mean, I was kind of raised in that. You know, my family was certainly not blue blood type of family, and I wasn't. You know, like my dad wasn't a member of a country club or anything like that. I wasn't brought up that way. I had a nice upbringing, but it wasn't that. And so I just always identified with people that have less. And so that's where I've gravitated my career towards.
How has the practice of law changed over the years from a business point of view or from an office point of view?
Oh, boy, that's a good question. Can I tell you something that's really kind of off
Sure.
the necessarily practice of
Whatever you
law?
want.
I'm 72 years old and I'm still practicing, and I don't even have a plan to retire at this point, you know. But when I was 26 or 27, and I finally kind of maybe 28 took out on my own. Um, as you know, I love golf and I love to play golf, and I decided at that age that I was going to take off every Thursday afternoon to play golf, and that's saying a lot when you're 28. You've got a family and you've got a job. It's a first of all, it's a very selfish thing to do because you're taking time for you, you know, for yourself. But I can't even begin to tell you how that has helped me throughout my career because I look forward to that as soon as Sunday night and I got to go to work Monday. I'm thinking, okay, 3 more days and I'm going to get to play golf on Thursday afternoon. And it may sound trite, but it's worked for me. And if I had to encourage any young lawyer, uh, how do I avoid getting bogged down? How do I avoid getting overworked? I think everyone needs some time for themselves to do something. You know, it doesn't have to be golf, obviously, but have something that when you wake up on Monday, you got something to look forward to during that week. And for me, it was always that golf game on Thursday afternoon. And I have never felt burned out from practicing law. And I do think that's probably the reason because it wasn't all work. Now, obviously, when I have a trial or something of major importance, you know, that golf game goes away. But that was probably we look back at our lives and we think, well, what kind of wise decisions have you made? And sometimes we, well, my wife was a wise decision raising my children. But for me, that was a very wise decision I made. I can't say it's for everybody, but I think if a lawyer is working just 60 hours a week, 70 hours a week, and you're not taking any time for yourself to do anything, it's going to catch up with you.
I'm going to guess that had you gone to work for the Bamberger firm, you probably wouldn't have been able to do that.
And I took that into consideration. And
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. I know I wouldn't have been able to do that.
Yeah.
And at that point, when that job was offered to me, I was in that Thursday afternoon mode. And yeah, maybe I could have made a little bit more money. You know, I probably would have worked myself up to become a you know, a partner in that firm. But would I have been any happier? I don't think there's any way I would have been. So making money is nice, but being happy and maybe a little less money is much more important to me than that.
I assume that your technology in the office has changed.
Oh my gosh, yeah, it sure has. And fortunately, you know, I have learned to do email and you know, do a lot of different things that and use email a lot. And but you know, fortunately, the lady I told you I hired many years ago helps me with all of that. Oh, that is one thing that I think has really changed is just how offices are structured now. I mean, there's a lot of lawyers that are sole practitioners, or maybe just one or two that don't even have a secretary anymore. I mean, they can do things on their own. I don't have those skills, and I haven't needed those skills because my Susan can help me do those things. But I've really, you call people now on the phone. Of course, you can't get a hold of anybody. Voicemail is prevalent. Even the larger firms where you think they'd have people working there, you can't even get them to answer the phone sometimes. So, and the other thing I've noticed that's really changed is there's just a lot less formality. Like, the Casual Friday thing came in a few years ago, and now for Fridays, well, that Friday's gone into Thursday, Wednesday, Tuesday, and you go into some of the bigger firms now, and you think you're going to see somebody in a suit and tie, and you don't. Everyone is. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that you ask for change, and I've noticed that's a change. I still kind of like putting on a coat and tie. Now I go to court almost every day, so I have to, but I kind of like dressing up. I'm old school that way.
Think about the things that you have most liked about the practice of law or being a lawyer, and the things that perhaps you like the least.
The thing I like the most is when I get a positive result that really helps somebody. That is the most satisfying feeling, particularly when you feel your client was on the right side of the law. There's no better feeling than when you win a case and you really seriously feel like you've helped someone. I've had some cases where people have had alcohol or drug problems, and I've really tried to nurse them through getting treatment at somewhere and kind of followed up with them. And if they are successful, that's a tremendous feeling, because not only have you helped them with their legal problem, but you feel like you've helped them with their life. Uh, um, uh, the worst feeling, of course, is the opposite, when you get an opposite result and you feel like you put your heart and soul into something and it just doesn't pan out, it doesn't work. When I've lost a jury trial, the next day that I wake up, when I've lost a case, I've gone home and I've been so despondent about it. But the next day I wake up, I always feel much better. And I think the only reason that I feel that way is because I know I put everything I had into it. When I felt my worst is I know when I didn't put my best into it. Preparation. And I know I could have done this or done that, or maybe taken another deposition. I didn't do it. And that's when I really beat myself up. So prepare. And when it's your time to go to court, you be ready. And if you lose, you couldn't, what more could you have done?
If a young person came to you and said they're thinking about going to law school, what would you say to them?
Well, from what I hear, one of the first things I guess I'd talk about is, this is a big investment for you, because I've talked to some of the young public defenders and have overheard and have been told by some of them how much they owe in student loans. It's just enormous. It's like buying a house. And I can't even imagine. I got out of law school and I didn't have any debt at all. I just paid as I went. And I do think my parents helped me with some of that too. But, it's a huge investment. And then if, I'll talk to them about working for firms and what's going to be expected, and, how many hours now they expect you to grind it out, putting into hours. So I said, there's a lot to think about. If you think you're going to just become a lawyer and somebody's just going to give you a six-figure salary and it's just going to be, you're going to go in at 8:30 and get off at 5, no, that isn't going to happen. But I also tell them how rewarding it can be, and if you hang in there, it's going to be okay. But it's a big investment. It's a lot bigger investment now for these young people than it was, I think, when I went to law school. It wasn't nearly as expensive, and you didn't come out with a huge amount of debt. At least I was fortunate enough that I didn't.
So are you glad you left the railroad to become a lawyer?
Yes, I am, because I worked for Penn Central. They went bankrupt, probably because of me. They went bankrupt like a year or two later. But yeah, but you know what? I wouldn't trade that experience either. It was, I was working with these guys. I think I was a member of the United Transportation Union, and it was all good. I mean, I was like a duck out of water. There's no question about that. But but it's just more life experiences you have that you can find benefit from those, and I did. And just quickly on that point, I think the best thing I ever did one summer between I think my junior and senior year in college was work at Whirlpool, because it was a summer job, and they put me on the assembly line, and they always give the new guy the hardest job, and that particular job is the air conditioners come down the line. You had to fold these cardboard boxes, and there are four corners, and you had like 10 seconds to take four cardboard boxes that were flat and then fold them into corners. And I mean, my arms almost fell off when I went home that night. I did that for 3 months, and I looked at these men that had been there for 40 years and 45 years doing the same thing. And I thought, I can't do this for 40 years. If I get through 3 months, I'll be happy. But that was the biggest encouragement for me to continue with my education that I could have ever had. And I have all the respect in the world for those men and women that do those kind of jobs, but it's not for everybody. And if you don't think you can handle that kind of job, then you better get your education. So yeah, I have no regrets whatsoever.
Is there anything else you want to say for your oral history?
Oh my gosh, I can't even imagine anybody ever wanting to listen to this, but
They will.
I suppose so. But it's been a ride, and you know what? It's still going to continue. I mean, I'm thinking now. When I told you earlier that I took Thursday afternoons off, here's my retirement. I've added Tuesday afternoons and sometimes Friday afternoons, and anymore when I'm in court. And the judge says, "Well, can you be here Thursday afternoon or Friday afternoon?" I'll be very dramatic about it. I'll get my calendar out. I still use the old calendar. I refuse to start. And I said, "Judge, I really have an important appointment that afternoon." Well, they just generally smile at me because they know where I'm going to be that
You learned that from
afternoon.
George Barnett.
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. That's another lesson I learned from George. So anyway, that's my retirement, I suppose.
Well, thank you, Mike.
Well, you're quite welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you for asking me.